Louise continues to lead the team through discussing the remainder of the voted items on the board until they reach the final 30 minutes of the retrospective. Okay, says Louise, we've gotten through the majority of the items that were voted on. Now, while there are still a few items that we didn't have the opportunity to discuss, I want to be sure that we have plenty of time to collaborate on a plan to improve in the next sprint. As the final step of the retrospective, we'll take 30 minutes to work together to develop a specific plan of action to further improve how we'll work as a team in the next sprint. This plan will be comprised of action items based on what's currently in the third column. And that's a great explanation of how to develop the plan for improvement, says Alan, but I'd like to add 2 additional points of consideration for the team. First, as Louise mentioned, this plan will be comprised of action items. I would encourage you to keep your action items specific enough that we can unambiguously evaluate as a team at the end of the next sprint whether or not that action item was successful. This also means that the action item should clearly spell out the behavior change that we are seeking, not just vaguely state that we should improve in a certain area. And secondly, although many new Scrum teams can often come up with numerous ideas for improvement, I would ask you to remember that you will also be planning a full sprint's worth of work that you'll also need to focus on in parallel to these action items, and that Louise, as your Scrum Master, will be holding you accountable to completing each of them. For this reason, I'd encourage you to keep the set of action items that you select for each sprint small. In fact, I usually recommend that Scrum teams commit to no more than 2 action items from each retrospective to give you plenty of time to focus on each. Louise steps to the third column of the board. There were a lot of great potential action items that came out of our discussion today, so to focus our attention during the remainder of the retrospective, I'd like to repeat the dot voting exercise that we did when choosing which items to discuss. But remembering that we're limiting ourselves to only 2 action items, we'll each be allocated only 2 voting dots. After the dot voting is complete, Louise looks at the board. I'm sure that no one is surprised, but a pretty clear theme has emerged here. The top voted action item was to reduce the amount of work that we forecast for the next sprint so we can better understand what our sustainable pace is. So we'll be sure to take this into account in tomorrow's sprint planning session. But there are 2 action items that have both tied for the second spot. Let's start with the first one, which is Josh's idea of asking the company to buy pizza for the team a few days during the sprint to help us catch up if we start to fall behind. Josh immediately speaks up and says, I like this idea, but it doesn't hurt that it's mine. This worked really well at my last company in the sense that it let us catch up when we fell behind, and it was also nice for team building since it basically forced us to have a team lunch a few days per week. And hey, I'll never turn down free lunch. I get the idea behind this, Peter responds, and I suppose that I understand how giving us a few extra hours per week to work could buy us the time we need to be more consistent about the quality of work that we're creating. But I'm honestly just not crazy about the idea. 2 days a week I go to the company gym during lunch, and I usually run errands on the other days. I drop my daughter off at daycare on the way to work and pick her up immediately after work, so lunch is really my only opportunity to get the things done that I need to do. I don't want to lose that opportunity. I have to admit, I really don't like this idea either, adds Alan. Josh, you make a great point about the potential for team building that this creates, but you can also achieve that same result by just scheduling team lunches once a month or so. In fact, I'd even suggest that you specifically schedule them off-site so that everyone has a chance to interact outside of the context of the office. I don't see a problem with a company buying lunch for a team to help them squeeze in some extra effort on rare occasions, but I'm very wary about it becoming a routine occurrence. For one reason, this just isn't sustainable. People need their regular breaks throughout the day, and taking that away will quickly push the team into an unsustainable pace. It also sets the precedent in the organization that any team's velocity can be increased just by throwing pizza at it. But the biggest reason that I don't like this is that it addresses a symptom and not a root cause. Action items should address the underlying root cause that's causing the issue in the first place, not the result of that cause. In this case, the root cause was that the team wasn't clear about what was considered necessary for an item to be considered done, so quality dropped as the team rushed to meet their forecast. This action item doesn't address that root cause of having an unclear idea of what done means. It instead addresses the resulting effect of the team having to rush at the end. That's a very good point, Alan, adds Louise. Let's look at the other item that tied for the second spot. It was actually your suggestion about being explicit about what's necessary for an item to be considered done by the team. Yes, that actually ties in closely with the point that I was just making, answers Alan. The idea is that we collaborate as a team to decide what's important enough to us that we wouldn't consider an item done without it. For example, we may decide that every item must be peer-reviewed, thoroughly tested, and deployed to our staging environment before we consider it done as a team. We don't have to decide what that specific criteria is now, but what's important is that we commit to deciding on it and sticking to it during the sprint. This concept is called the definition of done, and it's actually part of the Scrum framework. But I didn't share it until now because I find that it's most beneficial if teams stumble upon the need for it themselves. This is a very powerful technique because not only does it hold the team accountable to the standard of quality that they've set for themselves, but it also makes the communication between the development team and the product owner, as well as between the product owner and the stakeholders, much more open, since you have an established definition to refer to of exactly what you mean when you say an item is done. As Louise sees the team nodding thoughtfully at Alan's idea, he poses a question to the team. Alan's idea seems to be the one that has gotten the most traction with the team in this retrospective. Is this the other action item that we want to implement as part of our plan to improve in the next sprint? The team enthusiastically agrees, so Louise removes the sticky note of the unselected item from the whiteboard, leaving only the two items that the team selected. As the team ends their sprint retrospective, Louise says, "Thank you all for a great sprint retrospective, and especially for a great first sprint. I'll see everyone tomorrow morning as we kick off our next sprint using the Scrum framework."